Hello, this video we're going to be going over some tips and tricks, things to help fix students' projects. Because sometimes when they come to you bright-eyed and filled with wonder, their projects, well, they need a little bit more love. First, we're going to look at some basic gluing. I like to start with a small dab and spread evenly with my fingers. You'll notice that I'm spreading the glue away from the inside joint. This makes cleaning it up afterwards much easier. Make sure your clamps are nearby before you start gluing. Last thing you want to be doing is scrambling around looking for clamps while your glue begins to dry. Start by lightly tightening the clamps. All you want is for them to be secure enough that they're not going to slide on you. Then, alternating back and forth, I'll slowly tighten them. When you're dealing with a miter, the kind of back and forth will help set it evenly. Once I have my piece clamped and in place, I'll grab some quick clamps to throw over top of the joints, or occasionally a block and just a traditional clamp. I find that putting pressure on it will flatten it, give you a much cleaner joint, and can occasionally get rid of some gapping that'll appear. So what I'm doing here is preparing some pieces to fill in the gaps in my joints. The way I do this is set my table saw to about 5 degrees or less, but the goal is to make a thin wedge that you can then insert into those gaps. I'll then break that piece to approximately the length of my gap. Then, with my finger, I'll spread glue into the gap and evenly on my piece that'll be shimmed in. Place the piece into the gap and gently tap with a hammer as you twist to slowly break the piece across the repair surface. Wipe the excessive glue into any remaining gaps. Some palm sanding over the fix and any mark of repair should nearly disappear. Now it's time for the handy-dandy X-Acto knife. So I use this to remove any of the tiny material that might have pushed through into the corner. By carefully cutting it, we can clean out and maintain that sharp inside edge. I'm going to go through the same process again, measuring out the length of my piece, breaking it, spreading the glue, and gently tapping and twisting the piece into the gap. It's important when you're sanding that you're keeping your palm sander flat. The last thing you want to be doing is putting any divots into your joint or on the edges. You're trying to keep it as flat as possible. Some quick cleanup with the X-Acto knife and you're good to go. Now while the X-Acto knife is in my hand, we're going to go over a little bit of an extra trick here. So what I've done is I use my X-Acto knife to open up the gap a little bit more, clean out any of the hardened glue. I'm going to rub some wet glue in there, and before it can dry, I'm going to sand over it to let it fill with sawdust. This one might take some practice to get really nice. Next we have a bit more of a complicated fix. There seems to be a break on the edge of this piece. It might have been bad material or a drop. But we're going to start by carving it out to make it a bit more rounded, which is going to make it a much easier surface to repair. Using some of the material from our previous fix, we're going to carve ourselves a piece to fill that gap. And while there is going to be a lot of time spent carving it to get it close, you don't need it to be perfect. Wood can be crushed into position, and it'll actually help it look a little bit more natural if it does have a little bit of that compression. So I'm just taking a moment to make sure that it fits evenly and that the entire piece isn't going to leave me with a new gap once I sand it down. Some extra time while you're preparing is going to save a lot of time in the future. It's not quite there, but a little bit more and it should be good. Once again, rule number 1, make sure you have your clamps before you start gluing. I'm going to use my finger to get a nice even spread across the piece. I really would just want to make sure that anywhere there's contact, there's glue. Green tape or painter's tape is really useful for holding small pieces like this in place. You can use it to just kind of temporarily keep a hold, so while you're clamping it's not shifting or sliding on you. When it comes to the clamping, you really want to make sure that you're applying pressure straight onto your joint. So sometimes that means taking a moment to look at which direction you're clamping in. Once it's clamped, I like to make sure that I have a nice even amount of squeeze out, which is implying that I've got even pressure across the joint. After giving time to set, it's time to clean it off. I'll usually start with my X-Acto knife to remove some of the excess material before I take this palm sander to it. There's just a risk of you tearing off your repair and having to start over. It's important that whenever you're using an X-Acto knife in this situation, that you're keeping control over your knife. So I'm using my left hand here as a bit of a guide and also a gauge for power. So I can push and also use it to restrain it from flying off and either hitting myself or somebody nearby. Once I have most of the material on, then it's time to clean it off with the palm sander. Same as before, you're trying to keep it as flat as possible. The last thing you want is to add a divot into your material. I'd urge caution about using a palm sander on a small edge like this. Unless you're really comfortable with one, it's really easy to put a bevel onto the material. A block can achieve the same thing and it's a lot safer. Once I've taken off most of the material with the palm sander, I will switch to the block just to make sure that I keep it flat and that I'm not accidentally over sanding any areas. Looking closely, I noticed that there's still a gap in my fix. And while that might be okay, I decided to take this one step further. So using the X-Acto knife, I'm going to clear out as much of the dried glue as possible. And using a very similar technique that I did in the corners, I'm going to take a small piece and just gently shim it in there with some glue. So it's very important that I'm going to find a piece that has parallel grain to the direction of my fix. I'm trying to match it as closely as possible to hide it. Unlike with the fixes in the corners, I'm not using my hammer to push the material in. I'm just sliding it into place because it's much smaller and I don't need it to really jam its way in there. The thing about some of these smaller fixes is that if you're very careful, you don't actually need to let the glue dry or set. If you focus on making all of your cuts and sanding in the same direction as your flake is going into your crack or hole, you can actually work with it while it's wet. And it actually helps because as the glue mixes with the sawdust, it'll help fill any of the gaps that remain. And there you have it, a nicely clean, fixed, and refined edge. But now we're going to take this one step further. What do you do when the fix that you're doing isn't on the edge, but right in the center of a project? To get this started, we're going to need some material. Now, the thing about picking material is first you want to make sure that obviously it's the same breed of wood, but also that the grain and color matches. Here I'm cutting off the discolored sections of the wood, just leaving the material that I want to keep for my repair. Once I have my piece, I'm going to be marking off approximately the width that I need to keep, and using a chisel and a hammer, I can quickly get a chunk that I'm going to be working into the shape I need for my repair. Sometimes before you can even begin the repair, you need to modify the mistake so that it's easier to repair. So that can be straightening out one of the joints or lines, whatever it takes to just make that piece easier to fit. Then it's some patience and whittling to get the piece to as close as you can. Depending on your breed of wood is going to change the level of accuracy you need in your repair. Hardwoods are going to demand a lot closer and much more precision, whereas softer wood you're going to be able to kind of crush into its place. Here I'm grabbing 2 blocks. I need these because it's a panel and not a flat surface. Otherwise, my clamps, which are going to go over top, are not going to be able to press down onto the repair. My 2 long pieces are going to be acting as an improvised clamp across my piece, while the small blocks are going to be there to create a pinpoint and focus clamping pressure on my fix. Once again, make sure your clamps are on hand before you start gluing, and in this case I use my fingers to spread the glue evenly around so that I have good, even contact on the entire repair. Placing my top block here to try and make sure that as much of the force is going into the deepest part of the repair. For the actual clamping, I would recommend finding a student or somebody else that can help you with this part. It can be very tricky when you've got it across a large piece. It's important that you don't clamp down the first side all the way. You want to try and make sure that it's as centered as possible so you have good, even distribution of weight across your entire repair. A quick check just to make sure that nothing has shifted and that everything is still pressing in the right place, and then you let it sit. It's time to see how our fix went. Overall, looks pretty good. Quick work with the knife to remove some of the high points, then palm sand to finish it off. Quick reminder, when you're taking a lot of material off with a palm sander, it's really easy to get in the habit to dig in with an edge, but you have to be really careful about that, especially with panels. And that's why I usually switch to a block to finish these things off, just to stay away from those kind of risks. And look at that, like I didn't break it. Alright, time for some fun. So let's say you just go to town on a project for a little while. Really let your anger out on it. This is probably one of the most unconventional fixes, but definitely one of the best things to know. Just like clothing, you can iron out dents in wood. So I went a little bit overboard on the water to begin with. You definitely don't need that much, but you do want your material to be nice and wet. Then, just like it's a wrinkly shirt that's been buried in the back of your closet for the past 3 years, you're just going to slowly iron out the moisture. As it dries, you can add a little bit more water, iron it out, and you should slowly feel the divot rise. Depending on how deep the dent, it might take a while to raise the entire piece. It's important that you're focusing only on the specific area, so you're not applying too much water and soaking the entire piece. You're just adding some water at a time, ironing it out, adding a little bit more, and ironing it out as is needed. The temptation can be there to just place the iron on the material and let it sit there as the wood swells, but this can actually burn the wood. You're still dealing with a very hot element on a flammable material. Once you feel that the material is raised enough and that it's mostly level, that's when you can pull out your palm sander and begin sanding it back to smooth. It's okay if once you've started sanding it, you realize that it still needs to be raised a little bit. You can very easily go back, add more water, iron it out, raise it up again, bring out the sander, and just continue on until the material is at a level that you're okay with. Sometimes the dent is just too deep, and you might have to dig into it a little bit just to give it that smooth finish. So now I'm just going to take my palm sander and remove any wet marks that remain. All of it is just surface moisture, so some quick sanding and you can just take it right away off. So you don't have to use the iron or anything tricky like that. Here I'm using the palm sander on the edge, but it might be recommended, depending again on your comfortability, on just using a block inside of some sandpaper. So there you have it, a couple of tips and tricks that I've picked up over my years of woodworking. I'm hoping that you've learned a little bit from this and you have some ideas how you can take some of these techniques and expand on them and adapt them to whatever problems you might encounter in your future. So best of luck and all the best. You've got this.